If you just looked at week 1, it would appear the argument that old running backs die at a certain age is a wrong argument to make in fantasy football in 2025. But as you know, it's a long season, and we're going to have to see if that holds up heading into week 2. So I'm going through the top 30 running back rankings for week 2 fantasy football, and I'm doing everything I can possibly to try to get us ready for week 2 fantasy football. So make sure to go down there and drop a like on this video and subscribe to the channel to show your support. So getting into our first here, I've got Christian McCaffrey and Derrick Henry at number 1 and 2. Again, our two old guys freaking dominated in week 1 fantasy football. Now, with Christian McCaffrey right here, look, there was obviously huge discussion heading into week 1 after we learned that he had re-injured that calf that he had struggled with all of last year. Well, the bottom line is he came out full strength, and the 49ers and Kyle Shanahan just can't help themselves. When he is available and on the field, they will use him into oblivion. And they're going to do the same thing against the New Orleans Saints on the road this week. And the Saints defense is nothing to write home about, to be honest with you. And I do expect McCaffrey, as long as he's healthy, to be in this top tier, because we saw it in week 1. If he is healthy and he is active, they will use him until they can't possibly do it anymore. So as long as he's out there, he's a top tier fantasy back. And Derrick Henry at number 2. Look, Derrick Henry, I was guilty of this. And I'm actually really pissed at myself for doubting Derrick Henry because of how different this guy is built. I mean, he's a Hall of Fame back in my opinion, no doubt. But Derrick Henry is uniquely built to handle the punishment that he gets on a yearly basis and the workload that he gets. He trains his body so hard, and it's just no wonder why he keeps dominating year after year. I am guilty of thinking that this could be the year we'd see the decline, because we did not get any indication from that. And this week, they're going back home versus the Cleveland Browns. They're pissed off they didn't win. I think this is a 24-6 type of beatdown where Derrick Henry gets another 100+ on the ground. I'm all over Derrick Henry again in week 2. And Saquon Barkley at 3 to round us out in this first tier at the Kansas City Chiefs. Listen, the matchup is not ideal in one hand, but it's also something you want in on in the other hand. Kansas City, the one thing that they could do against the Los Angeles Chargers was stop the run. Amari and Hampton had a rough day for the Los Angeles Chargers last week. At the same time, Kansas City and Philadelphia is a premier matchup that you want fantasy pieces in on. And Saquon Barkley, the way that he looked, it was obviously a tale of two different halves. One half was before the lightning strike and delay, and the other half was afterwards, right? So if you just look at the first half, Saquon Barkley was dominant in fantasy football, but then after an hour-long delay, he was not the same player. I'm going to choose to believe the former side and think that he's going to be a dominant player again in fantasy this week versus the Kansas City Chiefs in a Super Bowl rematch. Now, dropping down to our next tier, I also think this is more of an exclusive tier as well. I've got Bijan Robinson at number 4 and Josh Jacobs at number 5. Now, with Bijan Robinson, he obviously was a great fantasy back, but if you go over to FS Roundup and look at the usage on the site, this is really digestible information that my partner broke down for you guys, and this is all free access, by the way. Bijan Robinson and Tyler Algier, their workloads were not tremendously far off as you may think. It looked like a lot of past years with guys like Arthur Smith as the offensive coordinator, and even the beginning of last year. Bijan Robinson, where he saved his bacon, was through the air. He was dominant through the air. But Bijan, I do think in this Minnesota matchup, doesn't have that top tier upside because of the fact that the workload is more split than we may be indicated to think. Now, do I think that will keep up throughout the whole season? Probably not, especially if Drake London misses this game. But it doesn't change the fact that this matchup versus Minnesota with that Brian Flores-led defense, that's a tough one. So I've got him down here in tier 2. Josh Jacobs at number 5. It's a great Thursday night game to watch. I can't wait for this game. But I also think it's another matchup you want pieces on. This is a matchup in Green Bay versus the Washington Commanders, and I think it has a chance to be really high scoring. And if you just look at Josh Jacobs' efficiency last week, it wasn't all that great. He had 20 carries basically for 66 yards. He did get in the end zone to basically save his week. But I do still think that if you just look at the usage, again, on FSRoundup.com, you will see that he was still completely used as the workhorse. I do expect him to have better weeks than he did last week versus a divisional opponent. I think that this week could be one of those weeks for him. And I've got Chase Brown at 6 to round out this tier versus the Jacksonville Jaguars. Now, I have said this so far this week. I think that the Cincinnati Bengals rebound offensively this week. But I also want it noted, I could be jumping the gun. Cincinnati is awful in the month of September, particularly the first 2 weeks. So I may be jumping the gun here. But let's just say that I'm right. I think Chase Brown, when you look at the usage last week, he was the clear dominant workhorse. And if you just look at the matchup versus Jacksonville, I think that Jacksonville's defense looked better than they really are last week versus Carolina. They didn't take on an offense like the Cincinnati Bengals. So I think Chase Brown actually has a resurgent week again in week 2, along with many other Bengals players. Now, dropping down to our next tier, I also consider this an exclusive tier as well, and I'll tell you the reason why. Jahmyr Gibbs is at 7, Alvin Kamara is at 8. So with Jahmyr Gibbs, obviously there's a big discussion about what is going on with them, right? Detroit, I've said this all offseason, they were going to go through growing pains. Number one, they have a different offensive coordinator and a different defensive coordinator, by the way. And I just think that if you're not thinking along the lines that I have been thinking, which is that every offensive player won't be maximized in this offense to their full potential like they did with Ben Johnson at coordinator, you're not respecting Ben Johnson enough. John Morton is just not as good of a coordinator. 50-year-old first-time coordinator, that should tell you something in the NFL. That doesn't happen very much. Number 2, this offense is dealing with the loss of Frank Ragnow at the center position, which I will admit, I did not think it was going to be this big of a deal. It was in week 1 versus Green Bay. Now they take on Chicago, who also has a strong front 7 here. And the one thing that's saving Gibbs' bacon here for me is his involvement in the passing game. While you look at FS Roundup and what the breakdown was between Dave Montgomery and Gibbs, it was more concerning than I thought it would be. Jahmyr Gibbs is still super involved as a pass-catching back. And I just think if you're Detroit coming off an 0-1 beatdown, basically embarrassing performance, you've got to get the ball to your best players. So I've got Jahmyr Gibbs at number 7, and I still have Kamara in the top 10. Listen, the guy is going to continue to get used into oblivion. So I just don't see a world where I'm ranking Alvin Kamara outside the top 10 for the time being, especially when I don't think the matchup is particularly hard. Like, San Fran's defense is good. I do think they're a much better defense with Robert Saleh at defensive coordinator, but Alvin Kamara is in a position to where they have no choice but to use this guy all the time. So with Kamara dealing with these San Francisco defensive injuries as well, I do think as a top 10 finish this week, and it's just a cut above the below tier. But a James Cook at number 9 to round out this tier, he's taking on the New York Jets. Now, James Cook is in a similar situation to where he's always been in, which is that James Cook's volume is never going to be through the roof. They do not force feed this guy 20-plus opportunities per game. The reason James Cook is good in fantasy is because he's efficient on every touch. And he did the same thing last week in Baltimore. Well, the good thing is that he is just in an offense where he's able to realistically keep up with that efficiency because Josh Allen's so elite. And I also think that this is a matchup at New York where their defense was definitely exposed a little bit by the Pittsburgh Steelers. And James Cook, I think, is just going to be in a position to where they're going to be leading this game for a lot of it, and they could just run the clock out a bunch. So I do think James Cook actually does have a really good week in week 2. Because, again, if you look at FS Roundup right here, you'll notice that James Cook's volume wasn't great. But if you look at the RB usage, James Cook was still easily the clear lead back in this offense because every other running back, Ty Johnson and Ray Davis, when they were on the field, they weren't getting any work. So if you do want to utilize these tools, they are super in-depth numbers right here to help you make fantasy decisions. Go to fsroundup.com. This is actually completely free information right here. Now, dropping down to our next tier, I've got Kyren Williams at number 10 and Jonathan Taylor at number 11. So with Kyren Williams, he goes to Tennessee this week to take on the Titans. And one thing was made clear last week. All the hype about Blake Corum getting more work and stealing stuff away from Kyren was wrong. And Kyren Williams still has a very, very sought-after role in fantasy football as far as running backs go. He's the goal line back, and he's very efficient at doing it. That's why they wanted this guy to a new deal. He gets in the end zone at the goal line, and he did it last week, and I think he'll do it again this week. That being said, I think Tennessee's defense showed a lot versus the Denver Broncos. That's a tough defense right there. So I actually don't think Kyron's getting that much of a break in the matchup here. The only break I think he's getting is that they will beat Tennessee, I think, a little easier than they beat the Houston Texans, which could offer more opportunities for Kyron on the ground this week as a whole. Jonathan Taylor at 11 versus Denver. Listen, I had Jonathan Taylor very highly ranked last week, and I think he would have executed on that if he didn't get injured. But that's the important thing. He did get injured in this game. Looked like a neck injury situation, which is never good. But it doesn't appear to be bothering him that bad at this point in the week. And we don't have an injury report yet, so you're going to have to keep an eye on this one. But there's no question. Denver's defense will be a stark contrast between Miami's defense. This is a much tougher matchup. And rankings this time of the year, matchups come into play big time. I think Indianapolis offense has a setback this week, and Jonathan Taylor, while if he is healthy, is still a good player, I don't think you could consider him a top 10 guy this week. Bucky Irving is at 12, and Achane had to tumble a little bit down to 13. Bucky Irving goes to Houston on Monday night, and I'm excited for this game, but I will tell you, I have said this throughout the week, I think this could be a scrappy game. Bucky Irving could be in position to where he may struggle to get much more efficiency than he did last week. And last week was a little concerning because he was definitely the clear RB1, which kind of erases my fear that I had during the offseason, which is that Bucky Irving would be a guy who would share the backfield with Rachaad White to a point. While Rachaad White was the running back in third down usage, Bucky Irving definitely handled all of the volume, basically. So volume isn't scary. The defensive matchup, it definitely is scary. In Houston this week, it doesn't make me feel great about the matchup, so I'm keeping Bucky at 12 because I respect Bucky and his talent and the offense as a whole, but this matchup is no doubt a really tough one. And then Achane at 13. He goes back home to take on the New England Patriots, and I got to tell you, man, I watched this game, Miami and Indianapolis, and it was one of the saddest things I've ever seen in a long time. They looked completely, not just helpless and not just hopeless. They looked like they didn't care. In week one, I mean, how concerning is that when every team at this time of the year is supposed to be full of hope? Miami looked like they had nothing going for them. So even though I think Achane is a great player and probably the best player on that offense at this point, you have to move him down these rankings because if this offense continues to show nothing, then you can't have an RB that sort of gets limited volume while he is the lead back that much higher than a top 12 finish. And I would go as far as to say this. An RB13 ranking right here is actually just goes to show how much I respect Achane. Because this team, if it was any other running back, they would not be in the top 15. Achane's just that good, so he's going to be at 13 because he's that good. Now at 14 and 15, I got Ashton Jeanty, and Travis Etienne makes his glorious return into my top 20. Ashton Jeanty versus the Los Angeles Chargers. Listen, it was a rough week for him last week. He was so inefficient, and I had been alluding to this for a while. I figured that Ashton Jeanty would be inefficient all of his rookie season, not just this past week. I didn't see him being that inefficient. So I'm hoping we could see better from him in week 2. But I will say the matchup doesn't make me feel like it will be much better. Versus Los Angeles, who really shut down the run for the Kansas City Chiefs last week. I don't know if this is going to be a spot where he can see much improvement. So I'm a little worried still about Ashton Jeanty. I think when his schedule lightens up, that's when you'll see him higher ranked in my rankings. And then with Travis Etienne at 15, it's been a long time since I've had him inside the top 15. It feels weird, but I will tell you this. I have so far been right about Travis Etienne for 3 straight years. I called him a league winner in 2023. He was that. I said, don't draft him in 2024. You shouldn't have drafted him. And in 2025, I said, I like this guy in 2025. Now, I cooled off of him towards the back half of the offseason, but Travis Etienne was just given the green light, not only in week 1 with the usage, but also with Tank Bigsby jettisoned out of town to Philadelphia. It's Travis Etienne's backfield, and this is a matchup I want. We already saw the usage and the efficiency with Travis Etienne in week 1. And now we get a Cincinnati Bengals matchup, which is not something that you need any fear of. So Travis Etienne, to me, at this point, is a consistent top 20 back and someone that should definitely go in your lineup at this point. Chuba Hubbard's at 16 to round out this big tier at the Arizona Cardinals this week. Now, with Chuba Hubbard, I do think that There's a couple things that need to be put into context. With Chuba, he did have a solid week in fantasy last week. But again, if you go to fsroundup.com and look at his usage, he was out on third down. So Rico Dowdle is the third down running back in this backfield. And number two is that Chuba, if he did not score a touchdown at the end of that game, he would have been pretty bad in fantasy last week. This Carolina offense looks very similar to how they did at the beginning of last year. Not as inept, but I would say they took a step back. So even against Arizona, which is a matchup theoretically can be beaten, I just don't know if I can see much more upside for Chuba than running back 16.
This is Ted. Look at him. Ted desperately needs to pick up a new running back, or his fantasy team is toast. For the third year in a row. And losing his season again means one thing.
Oh, no.
Don't be Ted. Use Fantasy Football Roundup to automate your waiver pickups and take a breather this season.
Hey, you got 7 more laps.
Dropping down to our next tier, Amari and Hampton is at 17, and Jacory Crosky-Merritt, let's go, is at 18. I think Amari and Hampton, there's a couple things to think about. Number one is that he had to drop because of just how bad he looked last week. And I get it. Kansas City's a tough matchup. Steve Spagnuolo versus a rookie is not an ideal matchup whatsoever. But I also do think that there's a chance that he could be better this week. Like, I do actually expect him to be more efficient this week. And I do also expect him to continue to get the majority of the usage as he did in week 1. But I will say, just based on his performance last week, I didn't see much there to where I can confidently put him back inside of my top 15 and say, yes, go ahead, he's locked and loaded for you. I don't feel that way. Like, I do think that he could be, but I want to see this one play out a little bit first. And Jacory Crosky-Merritt, a.k.a. Bill Crosky, at the Green Bay Packers on Thursday night. Again, it's a matchup you want in on, and we got some news. Austin Eckler is dealing with injury right now, and Bill Crosky was the most efficient back by far in the run game and just overall for the Washington Commanders in week 1. The hype is real at this point. This is a flexible player. You heard it here first. I am not joking when I say you can play Jacory Crosky-Merritt this week. It will definitely be a situation-specific thing on if I guide you to flex him, but I will say he is 100% in contention to be in your flex this week and even be a running back 2 this week. Zach Charbonnet is at 19 and James Conner is at 20. Now, Zach Charbonnet, I also discussed this on what I got right and what I got wrong in week 1 last night. Zach Charbonnet was the favorite back in Seattle as far as usage goes in every situation, and he was the more efficient back. This is a matchup that you want in on. Pittsburgh was ripped to shreds by the Jets running game just a week ago. So this is not a matchup that you should fear as much as you would theoretically fear on a year-to-year basis. Pittsburgh's run defense is actually a disgrace if you want to know the truth. So Zach Charbonnet, if he gets the volume that he did last week, this guy's a top 20 play for me. And then James Conner at 20 versus the Carolina Panthers. Again, the matchup I think is really good. Like, they were really kind of disgustingly bad in week 1 versus Jacksonville. Like, I think that Arizona in this run game, James Conner is someone I've got my eye on in a negative way. But I will also acknowledge, while James Conner is still healthy, he will still continue to get a bunch of work in this backfield. And in a matchup that I think they could very easily win, James Conner should be inside the top 20 because he still is the most used back in the backfield as of right now, and keep an eye on it again. And then 21, DeAndre Swift to round out this tier right here at the Detroit Lions. Now, didn't go as planned. For me last week, he was not a must start like I thought he would be. But DeAndre Swift was fine, and he was heavily used. And that's the important thing to remember. Because Kyle Monangai was active in that game, and he was barely used in that offense. So DeAndre Swift, by all accounts, looks like the clear lead back in Chicago. Not only running the ball, but he gets a lot of pass-catching work as well. So I think that DeAndre Swift is pretty much an every week solid RB2 and solid flex for your team. Now, he'll have better weeks than this one at Detroit. I think Detroit comes in pretty mad, and they give a potential beatdown to Chicago. Like, honestly, I really do think they could. But Detroit's defense was very vulnerable last week, so maybe Chicago is able to game plan around that. Ben Johnson's a smart offensive mind, so I could see a world where DeAndre Swift finishes higher than this, but I will put him at 21 for now. Dropping down to our next tier, Breece Hall is at 22, and Tony Pollard's at 23. Now, popular opinion may be to rank Breece Hall much higher this week based on the efficiency that he showed, and I wouldn't even blame you. I said this for not just last week, all offseason. I am guilty of being a Breece Hall guy. I love the talent, and I ranked him higher than I think most people would have comfortably against the Pittsburgh Steelers last week. Now, this matchup is a game script thing. It's not that I don't think Buffalo can't be run on. They were just run all over by Derrick Henry just a couple nights ago. But Breece Hall is in an offense I think gets more exposed this week by Buffalo, and they're not in a game script to where they can run the ball comfortably as much. So Breece Hall, I do think, is the lead back still because he was definitely the best, but I do think there's matchup issues because of game script this week. And Tony Pollard at 23 versus the Los Angeles Rams is still in the same position. He's going to get a bunch of volume this week, just like he did last week with 20 opportunities last week. But the thing you have to factor in is that Tony Pollard is not getting much of a break in matchup. Last week was tough at Denver. This week is at home, so it gets him a little bit of an advantage. But the Rams defense is also really, really tough. So this is not a matchup that I think you say gung-ho on Tony Pollard. Like, this offense didn't show me enough to where I could feel comfortable playing Tony Pollard above guys like Swift, Connor, Zach Charbonnet, Breece Hall. I think that Tony Pollard is still in this range where you obviously should play him because he should get a lot of volume, but you should not overplay him over someone who could be a lot more efficient on maybe just 5 touches less. Trayvon Henderson is at 24, and Tyrone Tracy Jr. is at 25. I will tell you this right here. I had to fight my better instincts to put Trayvon higher than this. I was very close to putting Trayvon inside my top 20 because Miami is literally the perfect matchup. Miami was so disgraceful in week 1, and I just don't see how it gets much better. But that being said, you cannot ignore usage. Running back usage with the New England Patriots this past week indicates my worst fear, which was that Josh McDaniel, old school coach, and Mike Vrabel, old school coach, were still using Ramondre more than Trayvon. Now, Trayvon was the most effective back by far, so I do think Trayvon's usage continues to go up. But until I see it, I can't rank him much higher than this. Tyrone Tracy Jr. at 25 at Dallas this week. Listen, I might just be a Tyrone Tracy Jr. fan, and that could be factored into this. That's not lost on me. Tyrone Tracy Jr., I do think is a good player, but as long as Russell Wilson is the quarterback, they won't be able to do very much. Now, it was very clear that he was definitely the lead back in this offense, and he was getting the most amount of volume. But considering that he was not much better on an efficiency standpoint than Devin Singletary and Cam Skattebo, actually Cam Skattebo was really bad. He had negative rushing yards by the end of the game. It's just a matchup that I think, in theory, could be taken advantage of, but this offense is so atrocious with Russell Wilson. I hope Jackson Dart gets in sooner or later to not only up the upside of Malik Neighbors, but to also increase the upside of Tyrone Tracy. But until that happens, he's got to be at this range right here at best. J.K. Dobbins is at 26, and he goes to Indianapolis to round us out in this tier. And listen, J.K. Dobbins, one thing became clear, which is that he definitely is the starting running back right now. As much as I like R.J. Harvey, and I do want to see him break out, it doesn't look like it's happening right now. And this is a matchup that I think is not as bad as people think. Again, week 1 can cloud a lot of people's judgment. It's week 1. That's the only thing that we have to go off of. Indianapolis will get exposed. And I think that this could be the week for it. Because Denver will come out swinging offensively because they got embarrassed a little bit too last week. Not a little bit. They got embarrassed quite a bit. But there's one thing that's clear. One thing remains true is that you want a running back on Denver's offense. And J.K. Dobbins is that guy right now. Now, dropping down to our last tier, I've got the 2 Minnesota backs still back-to-back, and I'll tell you the reason I still prefer Aaron Jones over Jordan Mason. So if you go over to FS Roundup and look at the RB usage, Jordan Mason was in on more snaps than Aaron Jones, and Jordan Mason also basically doubled the amount of carries that Aaron Jones did. Now, the thing with Aaron Jones, there's 2 things that make me want to pick him over him, which is number one, he actually got the short yardage carry, not Jordan Mason. So that was kind of counter theory to what I originally thought was going to happen. Number two, Aaron Jones was still very effective in the passing game. And this is a team that loves to pass the ball. And it's a matchup versus Atlanta that, in theory, could easily be taken advantage of. But at the same time, I don't think that there's enough evidence out there that suggests one of these running backs is the better running back. And I like Jordan Mason. I drafted a ton of him in 2025. But I'm not there yet as far as putting him above Aaron Jones. And at 29 and 30, to round us out, is Nick Chubb and Jaylen Warren. With Nick Chubb, he goes back home to take on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers on Monday night. Nick Chubb was clearly the lead back. It wasn't even close. The one guy who actually gave him trouble, and I thought it was going to be Woody Marks, it was Dare Ogunbowale. He was the guy who was getting the reception work out of the backfield. Nick Chubb, though, still dominated the carries. And he actually looked better than last year doing it. So that did give me some hope. And versus Tampa Bay, it is a break in the matchup. So I will go out on a limb in saying this. I might have Nick Chubb too low ranked, but I'm not comfortable doing it yet because I still do need to see it first with Nick Chubb. And with Jaylen Warren at 30, listen, he's going to be consistently around this for multiple reasons. Number one, the Pittsburgh Steelers offensive line is awful. They were bullied like crazy by the Jets defensive line. They could get no push, so they can't run the ball. Number two, Jaylen Warren was used in a lot of pass blocking situations versus the New York Jets. And if that offensive line continues to be bad, Aaron Rodgers needs that more than ever. So realistically, when you get Kenneth Gainwell as involved as he was last week, Jaylen Warren just doesn't have that much more opportunity for upward movement. Versus Seattle's defense, it's not that much better of a matchup. So I think it could be very similar, if not worse, than it was in week one. So let me know what you think of the rankings in the comments below. And if you want to see the top 12 defense rankings for week 2 fantasy football, click on this video right here.